Money!
What Your Bank Doesn't Tell You, a podcast by You Mushroom.
Hello everybody and welcome to our podcast, What Your Bank Doesn't Tell You. Today we are talking about the European Parliament election, which took place from the 6th to the 9th of June. And this is an event which was expected with big attention because we could also observe that many citizens of the European Union, they are not really happy with their traditional governments. So it was an event which all eyes got focused on. And now also after the election, there is a lot to digest and to discuss. We also discussed the election on our lunch table with the team, and we would like to share our discussions and also how we judge the impacts on the market.
Welcome also from our side. Indeed, an amazing year when it comes to elections. I think there are around 30 countries, if I'm not mistaken, 33 countries are electing president, and 20 countries this year are electing parliaments. And we have this major event between the 6th and the 9th, as you say, which we've been following closely. As always, we're going to discuss how does such event impact the markets, or does not impact the markets, of course. But maybe first, let's shed some light how actually the European Parliament functions and how are actually the elections.
Yeah, it's very interesting because each country which is part of the European Union gets a dedicated amount of seats in the European Parliament. Then the citizens of the respective country, they actually elect directly the representatives of the European Parliament by voting the parties which are constituted in their specific country. And then once the members of the European Parliament are elected, these members, they are getting associated with an international or a Europe-wide party. Or also, you can also say that the national parties, they are related to a cross-national party. So in the end, we will have a distribution of major blocks or fractions in the European Parliament.
And what's very interesting also, the number of seats which a country can actually vote for is proportional to the number of citizens they have. So you can expect that the top 5 countries which represent around 50% of the seats are obviously Germany with 96 seats, then followed by France with 81, Italy with 76, Spain 61, Poland 53. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. It covers 50% of the seats. And the total number of members of the European Parliament to be elected, or which were elected, is 720.
It's a big parliament, right? I mean, it's
a huge number.
It's plenty of people, and well, of course, also representing a quite large area of our world. But a part of the distribution according to the nations, it was also interesting to observe the distribution among the fractions and the parties we discussed before. And it's very interesting that the biggest blocks, they are kind of stable. So we still see the biggest representative is the European People's Party with 186 representatives, followed by the Socialists and Democrats with 135 seats, and then Renew Europe, which are basically the Liberals, with 79 seats. But there is a big but. The winners and the losers, there we still saw some surprises.
Indeed, we really saw some surprises, and you probably read and hear everywhere that there is quite a shift, actually, particularly among the young generation, who was also voting rather towards the right. And what's interesting to see is actually the biggest winners are the European People's Party with plus 10 seats. Then we have the Identity and Democracy Party, a group with plus 9 seats, and these are rather towards the right, the second ones. And the biggest losers, actually, if we can say that, in terms of number of parliament members, are the Renew Europe, who lost 23 seats, right after followed by the Green with minus 18 seats. Mm-hmm. And we can see that, and we'll follow up to that. It's very interesting to understand also what are the triggering points, what are the reasons why actually this is happening.
You mentioned the reasons, and what I also found interesting is that the big winners, like the ones you mentioned, the Identity and Democracy, which which, for example, the AfD and the National Rally in France, the party of Marine Le Pen, and also Lega in Italy are part of, they are touching many topics which other parties try maybe to avoid, or they don't have it on the agenda. And we checked it before. What are the biggest drivers why these parties gain so many seats? And one is that many people, they experience increased criminality. Then still climate change is a big topic, but less of a topic than when we had the last election. Then freedom of opinion. This was a very interesting one, because this was basically not a topic at all with the last election, but it somehow became a topic over the past few years. And then also the impact of other religions, Islam, for example, in our countries. All these topics, they are taken care of by the more populist parties in the end. And to us also surprising was how active these parties are also on social media. And you mentioned before that even the younger generations, they tend to vote for these populist parties. And I believe this could be a reason that they have a very good marketing strategy as well.
Yes, they speak indeed. They use the channels of the young generation. And as you know, it's interesting. For example, in Germany, you can vote already with 16. I believe there are two other countries who allow voters starting with 16, and normally you would have from 18 onwards. And what is Austria was, I think, starting from 17. And what's very interesting also to know is that a reason which we also keep hearing here among our younger millennials is the fact that costs of living has substantially increased over the past 5 years. We looked into the inflation numbers, and alone in Germany, inflation actually cumulative has risen since 2020, around pretty much since the last elections actually for European Parliament, of around 20%. And in Switzerland, well, we're not in the EU, but just as a comparison, it's something along the line between 6 and 8%, which is quite substantial. In the EU, if you think.
Yes, 20% is
Germany,
a lot.
particularly.
And just to give you an example, I mean, if you went on holidays for 10 days 4 years ago, then in the meanwhile, you have to pack your suitcase again after 8 days, or basically after 1 week, because it's by 20% more expensive. And this is a lot.
Yes, and it's a very good comparison to visualize. You pay the same amount, but you can actually buy much less. That's true. And it seemed to be a serious concern for young generation, how their costs of living are going to be secured. Can they build wealth? We very often hear that they don't feel safe, they don't feel empowered in the position to build wealth.
It's basically the needs of our daily lives, which many people feel they are not taken care of. And it's basically the issues which we have in our daily lives. And many people, they feel that the governments, they are not taking care of our basic needs in the end. And also, or maybe the biggest reason why these kind of new parties, they are emerging. But also very interesting is, given we have the election on the EU level, what's then the impact again on the national level? And I think we can say that in Germany, the biggest country in Europe, basically there are no major changes to expect immediately. But it's different in France.
France is different. If there is currently the government was dissolved, and what was very interesting here is that actually the National Rally Party gained substantially on weight. They currently represent 31% of the number of seats which they have, plus 12 new seats. Then you have Besoin d'Europe. This is the party of Macron, if I recall correctly, Need of Europe, which actually gained, which currently has 13 seats. Not changed in terms of absolute numbers, but in relative numbers, 14.6%. And then Wake Up Europe actually also flat, also with 13 seats. Interesting actually, La France Insoumise, Insoumise. La France Insoumise is actually the left party who gained 4 new seats and is currently 5% of the respective seats in the parliament for France.
It's a very interesting development in France. We have kind of the middle parties which are kind of flat, and then
the extremes
which are gaining in power. And I also believe that the move of Macron is very brave to dissolve the parliament. You mentioned it before, and very interesting to see what's the outcome. And I believe he thought it's the only way to free himself up of this kind of not
Legacy
being in a position to move anymore, and hoping that the citizens, they will confirm his power, the power of his party, in order to move forward again. But I believe it will be very interesting to see by the end of this month how these elections will go. And this is also what we see, this kind of uncertainty at the moment in the markets. I mean, let's assume that the National Rally, they will gain power. So this would mean that the parliament in France is getting dominated by that force. But then still Emmanuel Macron as a president, he has the mandate until 2027. So we have Emmanuel Macron as the president with a parliament and a minister most likely, which is not fully supporting his policy. And this means a lot of uncertainty, stagnation most likely.
Difficult decision taking.
Exactly. And I think these uncertainties, this is the biggest impact of the European elections, which we are currently experiencing in the financial markets.
And it costs a lot economically, because the two largest economies in Europe, the German and the French one, are basically not moving in a particular direction. Luckily, Germany has still a solid industry. Luckily, France also has some of the top industrial name in Europe. But yet, to be embedded in a macroeconomic environment where legislation is kind of not going in a concrete direction, this is really, as you mentioned, a lot of political and economic uncertainty. And what is interesting as well is the fact that roughly around this time, the European Central Bank cut the interest rates. I wonder, were those only economic rationales for that? And we know that currently the European economy is developing still well, or was it also kind of a preparation, kind of, getting additional liquidity or supporting this transition process also from the liquidity perspective, or from the true liquidity?
This is a very important point in my opinion, and also a very brave move by the ECB, because historically we could always see that the Federal Reserve, so the National Bank or the Central Bank of the United States, was actually the leader when it comes to a change in interest rates. So basically when a new cycle was beginning. And here in the first time we actually saw that the ECB is taking the first step and cutting rates. And we are expecting that the Federal Reserve is keeping the rates unchanged. So this is a newbie in the market, definitely.
It's true, and we're proud to say that we were the first mover here with our national bank.
Another thing to consider, and you mentioned that we might have stagnation in the EU, and that we have France and Germany, the biggest economies in Europe, which might be a bit sluggish when it comes to politics. Also, in comparison to the rest of the world, I mean, we have Asia, which is a very heavyweight in the meanwhile, and getting stronger and stronger in the international markets. And we have the US with a very robust economy as well. So you can argue that with this election, the comparable weakness which we have seen from Europe over the past few years might become even more pronounced.
Yes, absolutely. That's true. And not to underestimate the fact that actually in Europe we observe the tendency that the middle class is getting poorer through inflation. In Asia, the opposite is the case, actually. Well, in China, they had in the past couple of years issues with the real estate market, but they're recovering. And India is growing. Those are huge countries with billions over, I think, accumulated there easily. I wouldn't know if they probably account for 2.5 billions, but that would be a rough estimate of, don't quote me on that. And you can imagine the amount of people, plus the middle class there is, to my knowledge, according to the latest statistic, raising.
True, and it just shows that the impact of Europe is decreasing, and most likely this is also the reason why the markets, they reacted a bit, but basically they were unchanged more or less. So the equity markets, so the major indices like the DAX in Germany or CAC 40 in France, they lost 2% over the past few days, but 2%, it's nothing if we consider the market volatility over the past few weeks or even months. And then also on the interest rate side, I mean, there we saw a bit of a move. So the government bonds, the yields, they increased, especially for France, given the situation, by about 20 basis points. So this means that the market is pricing in this uncertainty. The government bonds, they have lost in price because the yields are higher. And then the euro dropped slightly by 2 cents in comparison to the dollar. So it's a negative-ish environment, but the reaction is kind of
zero,
moderate.
Yeah, it's quite moderate indeed, and you can always almost neglectable. And I wonder whether it was already priced in, which I would assume it was, or whether it was partially absorbed by the liquidity. What ECB did is also kind of a signal, or at least that's how I start interpreting it, is that it's a signal also to provide the necessary liquidity if politically it's needed to accompany the process. And this is obviously a consulting signal for the markets. But what you say is absolutely correct. It's the relative position of Europe compared to Asia is very tricky. We have very high production costs in terms of labor. We don't have access to cheap energy, as we know. And the third resource, the natural resources, the third production resource, the European continent is not known for having rich amount of the respective industrial metals, precious metals, or energy, and not to mention then the capital, the third resource, I'm sorry. So we have the natural resources, labor, and the capital. At least this one's getting cheaper because you have to somehow compensate. It's a little bit different in Asia, with a very well-educated parts of the population, very high working morale. In Europe, I think we have an average work week of, I think in Germany is less than 35 hours, or maybe 35 hours, something along those lines. In France, it's similar. And you can imagine what are the working hours in Asia. Not that we are proclaiming it's a good thing to do, but it is, in terms of working power, obviously, it has a substantial impact.
True. The economic or the comparable advantages, they are fading in Europe. You mentioned in comparison to Asia, but also in comparison to the US to a certain extent. And I believe the coming weeks until the summer break is starting, they will be very exciting. So we will see the election in France. Then we have some major economic data which will be released. So we follow this very closely and we will keep you up to date.
Stay tuned and thank you for your attention. And as always, if you have questions, we're more than happy to answer. Please write us at hello@youmushroom.com. Also, if you have a favorite topic which you would like to be covered by us, we are very happy to address your requests. Thank you and happy weekend.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Money! What Your Bank Doesn't Tell You, a podcast by YouMushroom.